Hi everyone, welcome to this week's edition of Behind the Code. This week we're talking all about the new Google Analytics v3 mobile SDKs. My name is Andrew Wales. I'm on the developer relations team for Google Analytics. And with me in studio is Jim Cotugno. He's a software engineer who works on our mobile app SDKs. And he's been around since the beginning, more or less.
Well, not quite the beginning, but pretty close. Yeah.
Pretty close to it. So he's a veteran. Been working on these SDKs for a long time, and he's been behind a lot of the changes that are in v3. So we're lucky to have him here, and we'll walk through what's new, give you some pointers about migrating and what to look for as well. So if you go ahead and take a look at the agenda for the show, I'll give you a quick overview on what's new. Then we'll talk a little bit about get, set, and send, which are really at the core of the v3 SDK, these three methods. We'll talk a little bit about session management and how that works in v3, what's changed and also what's staying the same. And then we'll take just a quick look at e-commerce because the model's changed a little bit, so we want to give you just a quick heads up about what's new in v3. Then also at the end we'll make time for Q&A. A lot of you posted some really great questions to our moderator page, so we'll try to get through as many of those as we can. So let's jump right in. So what's new in v3? So there's really four main things that are new here. The first and probably the most noticeable thing is that the APIs are now more aligned across all the different platforms. So you'll notice that Android, iOS, and also Analytics.js, our library for JavaScript, they're all very much similar in how you use or how you get, set, and send data. And we'll go into that a little bit further, I think. The second big thing that's new is that there's more flexibility in setting and sending data, and we'll go through that as well later on in the show. There's now forward compatibility with new hit types and parameters, and we'll show you some examples of how you can send any kind of parameter via our SDKs to the GA endpoint. And then the fourth thing is that there are some new debugging features. Notably, we've added a dry run flag so that you can enable this during testing so that you don't send test data into your production reports. And then we've also replaced the debug flag with this logger class, which is actually a little bit more flexible. If you want to learn more about the debugging features on this, go ahead and check out the migration guide on the developer site, which is developers.google.com/analytics. We're not going to cover them in today's presentation, but there's a lot of documentation there, so go check it out. So let's take a closer look at the first point. API is now aligned across web and mobile, across all these different platforms. Jim, can you give us kind of an overview of sort of what the impetus was for going back and refactoring to make things more aligned across these different platforms?
So what we wanted to do with this was to kind of unify the way you do your tracking calls across GA, whether you use Android or iOS platforms for mobile apps, or whether you do websites. So we didn't want you to have to learn a new way of doing things with each platform. So we kind of followed the Analytics.js route with basically three methods for your tracking needs: get, set, and send. And that's what you see here.
Yeah. Cool, and I think we'll see a bunch of examples of this later as we walk through some of the later slides. And also really quickly, I wanted to touch on the forward compatibility with new hit types. So how does the v3 SDK actually enable this kind of forward compatibility?
So the way it enables it is it's basically lets you pass in any parameter name and any parameter value through the set or send methods. And so previously in the v2 SDK, we had kind of predefined all the parameters that were enabled for the SDK to report analytics data through the measurement protocol. So we stripped all that out so that you could set anything you want, anytime you want. And this will enable you to add new parameters, new hit types as they become available in analytics in general.
Mm-hmm. Cool. So would this also let you, for example, could you now send like web page views from the app SDK?
You could. You could.
You have
yes.
the flexibility to do that now.
Yes, yeah. Absolutely.
So that's cool. Okay. Great. And actually, here's an iOS code snippet as well. You can just see that we'll talk a little bit more about the dictionary builder and the map builder classes later in the show. But just so you can see a quick example of how you might set or how you might send an arbitrary parameter. in V3. And also how that shows up in the hit that's generated from that. Cool, so now that we've gone through an overview of what's new, let's kind of get more into the meat of V3. And a lot of that is going to be around using these get, set, and send methods and understanding how those work. So let's start with just a quick overview. Jim, can you give us kind of like an understanding of what the change is from V2? Because I know in V2 we had a lot of convenience methods.
Right. So V2, we originally started excuse me, with method calls that started with track, actually, not just send. So you had a track view, track event, track exception, and then we changed those to send to be more, more in line with what we were doing. But for V3, as I said before, to try and align with the other platforms, the other client platforms, we got rid of all those special purpose send methods and replaced them with send. So instead of send view, we have send, and then you would pass in a map of parameters or a dictionary in the iOS case that represented your app view hit, and then same with event, transaction, exception, etc. And then set, we had very specific set methods for things like setting campaign, custom dimensions, custom metrics, and those all are replaced by a general set method, which will take the field name and the value. And then for get, this is a little bit new to the SDKs in that you could actually query the values of the tracker objects that you've previously set or will be set for us on your behalf.
So pretty much any field can be set or retrieved from the tracker, right?
That's correct, yes.
Yeah. Okay. So let's talk, I guess, let's start with send, because that's probably the command that most people are going to be using most often. How does it work, basically?
So send's very straightforward. It takes a map for the Android SDK, and the iOS SDK would be a dictionary of parameters. Parameters have a name and a value, and they're both treated as strings. So we no longer deal with various object types like integers or floats or longs. Everything is a string for the send parameter, or send method, sorry. And then, so when you call send, what happens is the values stored in the tracker are merged with the values provided in that map. The values in the map will take precedence over what has previously set in the tracker. And then the hit will be queued for dispatch. And then you don't have to worry about it at that point anymore.
Right. One of the cool things in V3 that I definitely wanted to highlight for people was that it's actually pretty easy to build these maps of parameter value pairs, right? We have these map builder convenience classes. Can you talk a little bit about that? Yeah,
so because we took away the convenience method calls on the tracker, send event, send exception, we felt it would be very useful to provide some way to conveniently build various hit types so that you didn't have to remember which parameters needed to be filled in for each type of hit. And so the map builder class was created for that purpose. So the map builder has create methods for each of the common hit types, and that create method basically takes all the parameters that you would normally set up for that hit. So for event, for example, you have category, action, label, and value.
So as an example, we have like if we were sending an event that's somebody touches a button to play a video, for example. This might be an example of that.
Right, so here's a perfect example of an event. There's a couple things to point out in this example. One, first off, the map builder actually follows the builder pattern. So those of you familiar with that pattern will probably recognize this. So you create the map builder class using one of the create methods, and then you could optionally set new additional parameters. So here, for example, we're going to set custom dimension to a value of watched a video, and then when you're finally done with it, you can get your map by calling build, and then you're all set, and you just pass that to send, and you're done.
Cool. So you can set, I mean, it's not just, this example is custom dimensions, but you could set anything else you need to before you're ready to build. And
That's
you
correct.
can send it all in one go.
That's correct, yes.
That's cool. And then here's a So it's the same for iOS, right? It's
Yes.
You're building dictionaries, and the class is GAI Dictionary Builder.
Yeah, so we use the builder pattern here. With iOS, you don't have maps, but you have dictionaries. They're very much the same or very similar. So, yes.
Same thing. Cool. Let's talk about the set method. How does that work?
So when you set, the set method will make a permanent adjustment to your tracker model. So the tracker keeps track of all the parameters and their values that you've set. It's persisted, and it'll stay in the tracker until you get rid of it, really. So that way, if you have certain fields that you don't want to set, that you want to be set or on every hit, but you don't want to, set it in the map builder every time, you can simply just call set. Examples: the value is going to be persistent in the tracker. It'll show up on every hit, unless the map you pass into your send call overrides the value.
Right, because it'll take precedence over what's set on the tracker.
And if you don't want to set that value anymore, what you can do is pass null or nil in the iOS case as the value, and that field will get cleared out effectively.
Okay, cool. I think it's an important thing to point out that when you set something on the tracker, that value is going to persist sort of indefinitely until you destroy that tracker or until you override that value.
That's right. That's right.
So I know we were talking about before this, like there are definitely some good places where you'd want to set certain values directly on the tracker that are going to be applied to a lot of hits. So one of the examples that I know we talked about was, for example, here, whenever a view or a screen gets loaded, it's convenient to set the screen name first, and then you can send all your hits after that. So in this example, we set the screen name field to home screen when the view loads, and then we're going to send an app view, and we're going to send an event, and both of those hits are going to contain that screen name. I only had to set it once.
That's right.
Yeah.
And this is very important. Just like in the web case, if you want your events to be tied to a particular screen, this is how you have to do it. Otherwise, your events will not be attributed to that screen.
To a particular screen, right.
Yeah.
Or I know some other good examples were setting settings like anonymize IP or setting a sample rate, because those are tracker level settings, right?
Right. So when you set those, you probably want them to stay set for the duration of your tracker.
Right.
And so that those are good candidates for a set call in the tracker. Yeah.
And then there are some bad places to use this, right? Places, basically when you use this to set fields that you really are only going to send once, I think that's probably where most people will run into trouble.
Yeah, that's correct.
So I know the example we talked about was an event action. So if you have some kind of handler and you happen to set an event action or any of these like event fields, those are really only going to be applied. Those should only be applied to that one event. But if you set them right and then send other events, if you don't provide values, you could basically you're going to end up setting those event fields with every hit, which is probably not what you want.
Right. Yeah. So this is a bad example of what you would use the tracker set method for.
Right.
That's
and then another mistake I know I made once you pointed out earlier was, and we'll talk about the session control field a little bit later, but that would be one, you have this ability to start or stop a session by setting this field. And if you set that field directly on the tracker, you're going to be starting a new session with every hit, which
which you do not want.
A disaster, right?
That's right.
And I made that mistake.
Do not want that.
Please don't make that mistake. Cool. Okay, so lastly we talked about send, set, and then the last one's get.
So the tracker is a model, and you could use it to retain values of the various parameters that you want to send to Google Analytics. So the get method lets you query those values that you set previously. So I guess the other point to bring up here is that if you haven't, the tracker has this concept of what we call default values for certain fields. So there's some fields that you really want to always set in the application world, things like the application name, the application version, the client ID is another good example. So we'll fill those in for you if you don't set them using the set method or pass them through the map in the send call. And so if you call get on those particular fields, we'll give you the value we will provide if you haven't set the value. So,
Right.
So for example, if you're curious to know what application name we're going to send with each hit,
Yeah.
call get on the application name field,
Got it.
and you'll see it.
So what about a field that doesn't automatically get set? Like if you called get on like campaign source, is it an empty string?
Yeah, it'll be I believe null
No. Okay.
So-
or nil. on iOS.
or nil in the iOS case. Correct.
And we should definitely get a list of those default values. We'll make sure
Yeah.
to get that on DevSec, because I think right now it's not there.
Yeah.
But we'd like to see that get posted.
The final note here is client. I know several folks using the SDK have asked for us to expose the client ID that we send, and we've done that with the V3 SDK. There's one very important caveat here, is all these calls are non-blocking calls, except for when you call get to get the client ID, you may block. So especially early in the life cycle of the application. So you won't want to make this call in your initialization code on the main UI thread.
Is that going to block because it's reading from?
Yes, because it's reading, the client ID is persisted on the persistent store on the device,
Right.
and it takes a little time to read up.
Cool. And then lastly, so I think throughout, as you call these different methods, you're going to be providing fields pretty much with every call. So I thought it deserved maybe just a slide to talk about what these, like how you access these fields.
So we,
Go ahead.
Okay, so we provided some classes that define constants for all the fields that you would commonly use in the application tracking world. And they're in the fields.java class. There's some examples there on the slide.
Mm-hmm.
In iOS, it's a GAI fields header file. We've also provided convenience methods for creating parameter field names for custom dimensions and metrics. As you know, those are repeated fields. They're like index, so you have custom dimension 1, custom dimension 2,
Right.
et cetera, et cetera. And
Cool.
so we have some convenience methods that will build the parameter name for you, so you don't have to figure it out for yourself.
Cool. And then the last one is sort of what we talked about earlier, where you can use this like ampersand syntax to get, set, or send any parameters, right?
Yeah, so the tracker understands the ampersand syntax, and so basically if you look at your measurement protocol, all the parameters there can be set using the ampersand.
Cool.
And
And
so ampersand T, for example, would be the hit type.
for a hit type, right? So this would be like an example for a new hit type that we release in the future.
Right.
But you could send, as you said, any measurement protocol
Yes.
parameter this way. Let's talk about what's new in session management in V3, and also what's the same, because some things I know have changed and some things are the
that's
same.
true.
So Jim, why don't you walk us through everything we need to know really about session management in V3?
I don't know if it's going to be everything,
Well, a
but
lot of what we need to know.
hopefully we'll clear the air a little bit about sessions.
Sure.
Okay, so in Universal Analytics, there was a change. This is like outside the realm of the app SDKs, but session management moved from the clients to the back end. So the back end for Universal Analytics, which includes the V2 SDK and the V3 SDK, the session management is handled by the back end. And the way it does that is it looks for a gap in time from one hit to the next. And when that gap is large enough, it will declare the end of session and start a new session. So the default value was 30 minutes initially, and that default value is now configurable through the management UI on the Google Analytics website. And if you look at the slide, you'll see a screenshot of what the page looks like that lets you control the session timeout. Session timeout's kind of on the upper right of the picture there.
Yeah, and then campaign timeouts there as well.
Yeah, campaign timeouts there as well. That's correct. Yeah. Okay. So in the V2 SDK, in order to get around that 30-minute window, which was the only window that the backend would support initially, we decided to add support in the SDKs for controlling sessions. And we did that through basically a property or a flag, session control. And behind the scenes, what that flag did was send a parameter called session control, or ampersand SC is the name, and it would send a start when it felt a new session should begin. And what it did is the way we did it in V2 is we just decided that if the app was sitting in the background for a certain length of time, I think the default was 30 seconds, we would set that parameter up and say, hey, we need a new session. We implemented that in Easy Tracker on the Android and in the GAI Tracker class that was returned to you when you asked for one on iOS. The other thing to note here is that when the trackers were first created in both iOS and Android, we would also set that session control parameter to start and send it with the first hit.
Right.
So that's how it worked in V2, and this was all to give you a finer control than that 30-minute window, which is what initially was the only way you could break sessions in the back end.
Right, right.
So given now that you can parameterize, you can control that window to a great degree with the UI, management UI in the application, the analytics application, we decided to kind of step back from it in V3 and clean things up. So if you want to flip over next slide.
Sure.
So in Android, in V3 for Android, the tracker class is no longer going to set the session control parameter to start ever for you. You can do it yourself. It's just another parameter. You can, again, don't use the set command, but you can set it through the send command in the map builder. Easy Tracker, kind of a side point, but the Easy Tracker now extends Tracker. So you can treat Easy Tracker just like your tracker, you call and get, set, and send. And the Easy Tracker for Android will continue to manage sessions as it did in V2.
Okay.
So there's still a parameter that you can control that will determine how long the app sits in the background before a session control flag start. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, so for people who are using Easy Tracker on Android and V2 right now to handle session management, for them there's probably no noticeable change in V3, right?
So the one noticeable change is when they first start. I guess you're right. So when the Easy Tracker first starts, it will assume a new session because the time, whatever time period you put in there, will have expired basically.
I see. Yep.
So yeah.
But for those people who are not using Easy Tracker in V3, they should note, especially this top point, that the tracker class will no longer set the session control flag to start when the tracker is created.
That's correct. It's a very important point. And if you're not aware of that, you might be a little bit concerned because your session numbers won't quite look the same.
Won't look the same.
As between V3 and V2. Yeah. For iOS, again, as part of this alignment, we wanted to make all the SDKs behave the same, and so we removed the session management code, which was in the GAI Tracker class from iOS. And again, like in Android, we no longer set the session control parameter to start when the tracker is first created. If you need to do this manually, which might be a good idea, you can look at hooking up to the notifications. UI application did become active and will resign active. And what you would do there is, did become active, you would look to see if a certain length of time had passed, which you would set up using the will resign active notification or callback. And then you can decide to set the session control parameter to start or not on the next hit based on the values you have there. So
for Android users who are not using Easy Tracker, but they do want the session control flag to get set to start when the app launches, for example, one way to do that be to subclass application in Android and do it in the?
Well, remember, you don't want to call set on the tracker.
Right. Sorry, don't set it on the tracker. Right. But you might want to set it on a screen view map, for example.
Right. So so your map that you passed in would have it set or not.
Okay. So let's take a quick look at what's new with e-commerce in version 3 of the SDKs. It's actually a pretty small change. Basically, you need to, whereas before you would basically send your transaction object in one hit, you would kind of create this transaction object and then add items and then send it all in one hit. In V3, there's actually you need to make separate send calls for each transaction and item. So the syntax is very much the same as sending app views or events in V3. So the easiest way to do it is to use map builder, and then you'd call create transaction, add everything, all the details there. Build it, send it, and then do the same thing for your items, all of them. One thing to, as always, make sure that the transaction ID in each item matches up to the transaction ID that you used in the transaction hit. But other than that, all the fields are the same. It's just that you need to make sure that you're calling send for the transaction, and then also call send individually for each item. Okay, cool. So let's take some of your questions. So the first one, Jim, can you please explain the relationship between sessions, session duration, and how active users are determined?
It's kind of a big question.
It is a loaded question.
It's a universal analytics question.
Yeah.
But I guess I'll take a stab at kind of explaining it a little bit, and hopefully maybe we can get some updates on the website that really kind of goes in this in depth.
Mm-hmm.
But so a session is basically a set of interactions a user has with your application. That can be considered like a single visit to the application. So, and those sessions will be made up of one or more what we call hits or beacons in analytics. The session duration is measured more or less from the time that passes between the first hit is sent or is generated and the last hit is generated. And then active users are basically the number of users who send one or more sessions during the particular reporting period in question. So that's kind of
if
simple answer.
If session duration is, what would happen in a session with one? So you said that we to get the duration, we look at the first hit and the last hit to get the duration. But what happens if there's only one hit in a session?
Well, then the duration is going to be 0.
It's set to 0. Okay.
So if you have a lot of sessions that are looking like they're 0 seconds in length,
that's what it is.
That might be what's going on.
Okay. Cool. So next question. Could calls, especially event calls, be batched at dispatch time in one single request?
We're looking at doing something like that, yes.
Okay.
So I can't give you any sort of commitment as to when or how, but yeah, it's been on our mind for a while.
Cool. So maybe coming soon. Next question. Is there a way to keep real-time analytics while using a sample rate of less than 100%?
Well, so real-time analytics takes the same data that you send to the website for the reports and just gives it to you a lot more quickly than you would get it otherwise. Right. So your real-time analytics data should be very much the same as your report data. So as long as you have a large enough sample, if your sample rate's less than 100%, I think real-time can still be useful. Right? Obviously, you're going to have to scale the numbers in your head or whatever. So we report the raw numbers, we don't report the sampled numbers. So for example, if you see 10 and your sample rate is 10, you could reasonably infer that you have 100 users of your app at that time.
Right. So basically the sample rate is going to just limit the number of hits that get sent from the client. But the real-time reporting isn't going to, it's not connected. I mean, it'll show all the hits that make it. But if your sample rate is 50%, you're only going to see one hit in real time instead of 2.
I guess the other important thing to point out here is that the sample rate actually is based on the visitor. So a particular user or visitor to your app will either report all their interactions or none of them. So it's not like you'll see like half the events this user's generated. You'll see them all if the user's going to report based on the sample rate.
Cool. So I have another question here about the new combined Google Analytics Services SDK. So with V3, we're sort of giving you analytics, but also Google Tag Manager together. So the question here is, will there also be an SDK version without Google Tag Manager? And they're concerned about the size of that combined SDK.
So Google Tag Manager and Google Analytics are like one product. They're just two different ways of doing things. So we're not going to have a separate SDK at this point. So the SDK going forward will always include both Google Tag Manager and Google Analytics. I wouldn't worry too much about the size. If you're doing development in iOS, for example, the Xcode will strip out all the code that you don't use, so your actual final binary will be smaller than you would expect. And if you're using something like ProGuard on Android, you'll get the same benefit.
Same thing.
So even though the SDKs are larger, the code that your app code shouldn't get larger as a result. It should be based. As a matter of fact, the iOS SDK, for example, the V3 version is actually smaller than the V2 version,
Okay.
even with the Google Tag Manager merge. So then the end result's actually better for you.
Cool. All right.
So.
Jim, any idea on when real-time events will be added to app properties?
That's another one I can say, yes, we want to do that. We're working on it. I cannot give you any sort of commitment as to time.
So maybe it's coming soon, maybe? I think we've got time for maybe one more. And this is a good one. Jim, this is a plea to you. Can you stop changing function names every 2 months?
We'll try our best. Yes, I do apologize for the fast pace of changes that we've gone through in the last year, but I'm hopeful, cross our fingers here, I'm hopeful this is the last time we change names, method names like this.
Cool.
So.
And now at least when you're moving from one library to another, for example, if you go from Android to the web, you should see more consistency across how to use each
and
of the
even Android to iOS, they're more consistent now than they were before.
Cool.
Yes.
Awesome. Cool. So that brings us to the end of this edition of Behind the Code. I wanted to pass on some resources to everybody watching. So we have getting started guides for the V3 SDKs for both Android and iOS. There's a link there. It's basically developers.google.com/analytics. We also have migration guides, and these guides cover migrating from V2 to V3, or even V1 to V3, so go check that out. We have a mobile app analytics forum. There's a link here. There's a lot of good questions and answers on there. I know Jim's an active participant in that forum from time to time, so there's a lot of good insight there. And there's also, if you're wanting to send measurement protocol parameters in these SDKs, so we showed you how to do that using that ampersand syntax. We do have a whole parameter reference that shows you all the different protocol parameters, so you can go check that out as well. And with that, thank you so much for joining us. That brings us to the end of the show. Feel free to reach out to us on Google+, and we'll catch you next time.